Good morning, church. So if you were not with us last week, we started a new series called Home Improvement, and this is a super practical series about home life. How do you build a better relationship with the people that you are close to? And one of the big things that we talked about last week was that the culture of your home will actually determine the quality of your life. We spend about 100 hours a week at home. And so if you have a dysfunctional relationship with a mom or a son or a daughter or a spouse or a brother or a sister or a roommate, if there's dysfunction going on in the home, man, that sure affects life in a very, very negative way. And so last week it was one big idea. And the big idea last week was we have to learn to follow through. Do not declare what you cannot deliver. Basically, you need to mean what you say, and you need to say what you mean. And if you do that, if you really start following through on what you say to the people at home, I promise you, your relationships with those people will get better. So here's a principle I want to start with this week. It's kind of one of those, you're going to hear it and you're going to think, oh yeah, I kind of already knew that. But it is true, and it's a starting place. We got to start here. The existence of home guarantees the presence of conflict. If you live with one other person, whether that's husband, wife, son, daughter, friend, grandparent, whoever this is, if you live with one person, I promise you, there will be conflict. Now, conflict looks different in different homes, but it is always there. In the Bible, there's this famous passage where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there I am with them. And that passage is talking about when 2 or 3 people get together, that God's presence is with them. Well, you could also say that where 2 or 3 gather together, the presence of conflict is always there. You can't live with somebody and there not be conflict. It's just given. So when I was in college, I had several roommates. One of my roommates, we're going to call him James. He loved music. And he was really good at music. He could sing, he could play guitar. He was actually really, really good at the guitar. Now, he had an electric guitar and he had a guitar amp, and he brought that amp into our apartment. Now, I've got nothing against music. I love music. I've got nothing against guitars. Love guitars. Can't play one, but I like them. I've got nothing against electric guitars. They're fine. What I do have a problem with is when my roommate played his electric guitar with the amp while I was trying to take a nap. This posed a problem. Years ago, I was diagnosed with mild insomnia, so it's not like terrible, but it's not like great. And so some of you in the room, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. If you have trouble sleeping, you know this feeling where you're getting close, like you're kind of starting to nod off. You feel those kind of this foggy state of mind, and you know that you're about to fall asleep. Well, I would get to that point, and then boom, the G chord. It would just, come booming out of the living room, and that would be really frustrating to me. And so this caused this argument with me and my roommate, James. So I would say something like, James, you got to find somewhere else to play. Like, just why are you playing inside the apartment? Just find somewhere else. And he would say, Phil, where am I supposed to play? Like, there's nowhere else I can play my guitar. Phil, you need to go take a nap somewhere else. And I'm thinking, James, where in the world am I supposed to take a nap? So it's this, it's the classic nap time, rock time dilemma. And we would argue about it quite a bit. Now, for you, your problem, your conflict, your tension at home, it's probably not a guitar amp. But it's probably something. Like, my guess is there's some people in the room, and you've got one spouse that really, really likes the pet, and the other spouse would be fine if that pet got hit by a truck. Well, it's going to cause some conflict. We've definitely got situations in the room where the son or the daughter thinks that doing homework during passing time between second and third hour is the fine way to do it, and you've probably got a mom or a dad that disagrees with that pretty strongly. My guess is we've also got some conflict that derives from undercommunication in the room. So the way this one usually goes is someone in the family forgets to tell somebody else in the family about some event that's about to happen. And so sometimes it goes like this. Hey, Mom, I forgot to tell you that there's 15 people coming over in 15 minutes. Well, that produces conflict. Here's one that I know many of you have dealt with. It's the definition of one simple word. It's the word clean. Anybody ever had a conflict in home? Raise your hand if you've had a conflict on either side of that one. The definition of the word clean. There's always conflict. When something bad happens in somebody's life, people at home grieve differently. And sometimes the way that you grieve actually creates a conflict with somebody else. It's not a guitar amp for you, but there's something. The existence of home guarantees the presence of conflict. It's always going to be there. And if you thought there was one group of homes these are the peaceful homes, and there's another group of homes and these are the troubled homes, that's not the way it goes. There is trouble and conflict in every home, and the way we should differentiate between the two is there are certain homes that bend and there are certain homes that break. And so when I talk about homes that bend, what I mean is there are certain homes, and when problems come in, they figure out how to adapt. They figure out how to stretch themselves. They might have to learn to love someone differently, but they adapt, they change, and then over time, they are able to absorb the tension. And then there's other homes, and it doesn't work out that way, and the conflicts just get too strong, and the differences of opinion, they're just too vast, and eventually those friendships deteriorate, and those children rebel, and those marriages end in divorce because they couldn't handle the conflict. There's homes that bend, and there are homes that break. And so, everybody's thinking right now, or in general in our state, many people are thinking, how do I make sure that my physical home can withstand a tornado? In the next few weeks, in the next few months, the sales on tornado shelters are going to go up. Because when tornadoes come, everybody thinks about it. I want to have a home that can withstand the tornado. What I want to talk about today is, how do you build a relationship that can withstand the tension? Because I don't think you're ever going to be able to prevent it completely. It's going to happen. But how do you build the kind of relationships with the people you love that can withstand this kind of tension? Now, there's 1,000 principles we could talk about as far as doing this, but I want to give you one principle from one Bible story that I think if you apply, I do think this one will make a difference in your life. But before we get there, we'll be in Genesis 41 in just a minute. Before we start reading that, I want to give you a little bit of hope. There's a guy named John Gottman, and he has done the most research on marriage in the last 3 decades than anybody else. He has a whole organization called the Gottman Research Institute. He's done 12 different longitudinal studies, studied over 3,000 married couples. He studies things like the physiological factors of fighting. So he measures pulse, blood pressure, what happens when you argue. He measures things like, do couples argue the same at the beginning of their relationship versus 10 years versus 20 years into their relationship? So the guy, he's just really, really well known. He's done a lot of research. In fact, one of the famous stories about John Gottman is that he is able to meet with a couple, ask them a few questions, measure a few of their reactions to each other, and within 5 minutes, he can predict whether or not that couple will stay married or get divorced, and he's 90% accurate. This guy knows his stuff. Here's, to me, the most astonishing statistic he's ever produced in all the decades worth of research. One of his studies found this. In healthy marriages, 69% of the conflict goes unresolved. In other words, this husband and wife, they know they disagree. They know there's something in the room that they don't see eye to eye on, but they don't push it. They just love through it. They love around it. And so the reason that this is so hopeful is because what this means is that it is possible for conflict to be present, but not to be dominant. It's possible to have the guitar amp in the home, but still figure out a way to relate to each other, love one another, and not let that break the home. So how do they do that? How do these couples do this? Genesis chapter 41, I want to look at a part of the story of Joseph. So the story of Joseph, it's one of the most iconic stories in the whole Bible. It actually illustrates one of the most prevailing features of the entire Bible about God. It's this truth that God has the ability to take something evil and to turn it into something good. Now, God does this a lot of different ways. In fact, just the book of Genesis itself gives us all these different pictures about the way that God works. Towards the beginning of Genesis, God is much more directly involved with creation. So he's the one coming down in the garden. He's the one shutting the ark when it comes to Noah. Towards the end of Genesis, chapter 37 through 50, the story of Joseph, God is, for the most part, working behind the scenes. He's still active, but you don't hear his name quite as much. But what he's doing in the story is he's taking all the bad things that happen, and by his mercy and his grace, he's turning them into something good. So if you remember the story of Joseph, there's a lot of bad things that happen. He gets thrown into a pit, left for dead by his brothers. He gets sold into slavery by his brothers. He gets framed by Potiphar's wife. He gets put in jail for years. And yet, through the adversity, through the pain, God uses Joseph to save Egypt from famine. Not in spite of all the bad things that happen, but actually because of all the bad things that happened to Joseph. God, over and over, just flips the script. In fact, at the end of Genesis, chapter 50, verse 20, here's a summary statement of what God does in Joseph's life. The brothers that at the beginning of Joseph's life had thrown him into a pit and done all these bad things to him, they're back. Joseph's now in charge. And Joseph tells his brothers this: "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." So this is just what God does. He takes something bad and he turns it into something good. And so in the middle of this story of Joseph, God does this principle of turning something bad into something good through Pharaoh's dream. So in chapter 40, verse 1, I'm going to summarize a little bit of this. Pharaoh has a dream. And I'll paraphrase the dream here. If you grew up in church, you'll probably be familiar with this dream. If you didn't grow up in church, this is a pretty strange dream. 7 cows come out of the Nile River. And these are like really healthy, big, fat, grass-fed, non-GMO cows. Like they're coming out of the river big. Then out of the river, 7 more cows come. So now there's 14. But the next 7 cows, they're not healthy and big and fat. The next 7 cows are ugly and they're gaunt, they're sickly. And then what happens in the story is that the 7 ugly cows eat the 7 healthy cows. Now, if I had to change one word in the story, which I know you're not supposed to do that because Revelation tells you not to do that, but if I could, I would change the word dream to nightmare. Like, this is a really gross thing that happens. I don't know why I never thought about this as a kid, but this would be like a scene from a horror movie. You've got these ugly, gaunt, sickly cows, and they're eating. Like they're ripping apart the flesh of these enormous cows, and this is the dream. This is a very, very scary dream. Now, there's a point to it. Pharaoh tells Joseph the dream, and Joseph turns to Pharaoh and says, well, here's the deal. This dream means that there is going to be famine in the land. So you're going to have 7 really good years, and we're going to have lots of grain, and that's the good cows. But then there's going to be 7 years, and there's not going to be hardly any food at all. That's what your dream means. Genesis 41, verse 48. Pharaoh appoints Joseph to manage the problem, and here's what Joseph does. So Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. So Joseph prepares. You might remember back to Y2K. So between the year 1999 and the year 2000, people kind of went berserk around the country. And if you weren't alive at that time, what was happening is that all the clocks and the computer systems were about to change from 1999 to 2000, And nobody knew if our technology could handle that. And so a lot of people thought there was going to be this apocalyptic meltdown. And so everybody started getting ready. They started buying lots of bottles of water. They started buying lots of canned goods, and they started putting all these things in the basement of their houses. Well, this is more or less what Joseph is doing, except Joseph is doing this on a larger scale. For 7 years, he's piling grain, not just in people's basements, but he's filling up entire buildings full of grain. 7 years. And so I'm sure people would have asked him, Joseph, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? And Joseph's only response could have been, well, Pharaoh had a nightmare. That was the only reason. And so surely people thought Joseph was just a lunatic, and yet he stuck with the plan. He kept saving all this grain. And lucky for Joseph, it happened just the way that God had told him in the interpretation of the dream. Verse 53. The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. So in this story, God takes something bad and he makes it good. So what in the world does this have to do with home? Well, think with me for just a minute. Is there both good and bad in your home? Of course there is. You've got memories around your dining room table of laughter and arguments. There's both good and bad. Well, in Egypt, there was also both good and bad. There was good years, there was bad years. And if you'll notice, there was nothing magic that Joseph did to get ready for the bad years. He knew they were inevitable. They were going to happen. Just like you know that conflict is inevitable in your home. So how did Joseph manage the famine? It's pretty simple. He surrounded the bad with the good, and eventually the bad surrendered to the good. So for 7 years, he worked hard to generate so much food that it couldn't even be calculated. I mean, you've got houses and barns that are full of grain, so much grain, it's like there's the sand on the seashore. So when the bad came, when the famine came, it didn't even stand a chance. It was already surrounded. The famine was outflanked by the feast, and the famine simply could not survive. Imagine for a moment if Joseph had not done it this way. Let's say Joseph would say, yeah, I know it's coming, but we're not going to get ready. We're not going to store the grain in the barns. What would have happened if Joseph had done it that way? Well, the famine would have come, and the famine would have no foe. The famine would have no system set to attack it. And so the famine would have festered. It would have lingered. It would have crippled the people. No one could have gone anywhere without talking about the famine. It would have been dominant. This is exactly what happens with conflict. When we don't prepare for it, when there's no good surrounding it, then what happens? It festers, it lingers, and we can't talk about anything else but the conflict. So are you starting to see the main idea here? Here it is. And this is the one thing I want you to know. It's the one thing I want you to apply. Here it is. Conflict surrenders when it is surrounded. Conflict surrenders when it is surrounded. Let's repeat this one with me. Here we go. Conflict surrenders when it is surrounded. One more time. Conflict surrenders when it is surrounded. So take an argument. Maybe there's a married couple and the wife and the husband are arguing because the husband really wants the wife to go to some event. Maybe it's a work event. Maybe it's a 4th of July family celebration and the wife's like, honey, I just don't want to go. I just don't want to go. And this causes somewhat of an argument. Now, let's say there's one married couple and this married couple, they go bowling every single Friday. And they often talk about some inside joke that they had on some vacation in Florida, and they're always laughing about that. And they have this show they really like to watch together, and they always talk about that show together. And once a month they're going to Cold Stone to get a sundae because it's something that they like to do together. Now, for that couple, Is this argument going to derail their relationship? No. Because that couple has done so much work building the good in the relationship that the good is going to surround the bad. And when the good surrounds the bad just, it can't breathe. It surrenders to the good because the good is so much stronger. You see, the connected moments in life will defeat the conflicted moments in life, assuming that the connected moments are even there. Now let's flip it. Let's take married couple B. Same argument. Wife just doesn't want to go to this event with the husband's work. Now let's say that this married couple, they don't talk that often. Every night they're spending about 3 to 4 hours separately on their own devices. They spend most of their days walking around the house thinking in their head how different they are from their spouse. They don't go on trips together. They don't go on dates together. They don't consistently talk deeply about life. How do you think that conflict's going to go? It's going to go pretty poor, because they have no reservoir. The well is dry. The conflict has no competition. And so what's going to happen is the conflict is actually going to win, and everybody else is going to lose. See, conflict, it's inevitable. You're going to have it. But it's surrendered when it is surrounded. Now, again, I'm not saying that it's going to go away completely. All I'm saying is that when you build up enough good things in your life, the conflict doesn't have the oxygen to thrive. Isn't that a simple principle? Like when you really start paying attention, you'll actually start seeing this principle pop up everywhere. So, for example, here's a verse in the New Testament where this principle pops up. 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter says, live such good lives among the pagans, that even though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day that he visits us. So in this case, we have this interesting example where Peter's saying, hey guys, there's going to be some unbelievers which don't like you. And they're going to accuse you of doing wrong. And maybe they're going to think that you're just really exclusive, or they're going to think that you're betraying the Roman Empire. I don't know, but they're going to not like you. But what's Peter saying? Peter's saying, I want you to do so much good that they can't even think about the bad. Like, I want you to feed the poor, and I want you to give gifts to unbelievers, and I want you to treat them with respect and dignity, and I want your conversation to be full of grace. Like, I want you to do so many good things that these people don't even see the bad anymore. Well, it's the same principle. Build up the good, and then the bad, it just can't survive. Conflict surrenders when it is surrounded. Here's another arena of life that I saw this principle in recently. A few months ago, last fall, I had this kind of strange running injury. It's called an avulsion fracture. Got an X-ray, and there was this very tiny bone, smaller than a skittle, that had peeled off of my ankle. And it hurt and it ached, and I saw a few different doctors. And one thing that was so helpful, the most helpful thing that anybody told me, is from my physical therapist, David Huslick. He goes to this church. And he told me last fall, he's like, Phil, here's what you're going to have to do. You've got to make your ankles stronger. You've got really weak ankles. And he gave me all these exercises to do to start working on my ankle muscles. And the theory was, he was like, Phil, if you can just build up all the muscles around your ankle and all those ligaments and all those tendons, if you can make them stronger, then what can happen is you will be totally fine even if that bone fragment is still there. And that's exactly what I did. For months, I would do these ankle exercises, and it worked. I made everything else stronger, and so in the middle of my ankle, there's still this little bone fragment, but it's surrounded by all this strength now that I can run again. You see, conflict, or in my ankle's case, this ailment, this bone fragment, it surrendered because it was surrounded by something really, really strong. Another example, we'll go back to my roommate situation. This did not derail our friendship. In fact, we were always friends in college. We never had a big fight about it. We're still friends today, and here's why. Pull this off. I've always wanted to give a sermon where I could talk about ping pong and running and the Bible together, because these are really the most three important things in life. I know, Paul says faith, hope, and love. It's really Bible, ping pong, running. Now, here's what happened with my roommate and I, James. We did love other things. We really enjoyed jogging together, so we would get out and jog pretty often. We were both ministry majors, and so what we did is we actually talked about God, we talked about the Bible, we talked about Jesus, we talked about ministry quite a bit, and we loved ping pong. Now, to be honest, ping pong created a second set of conflicts and arguments, depending on who won. But in general, we had all this good stuff surrounding us, and so at the end of the day, it didn't really matter that he played the guitar amp while I was trying to take a nap. We had so much good things happening in our relationship that the conflict did not derail us because we were that strong. The conflict surrendered because the conflict was surrounded by so many other good things. So, all this leading up to, here's your homework. 3 words. You probably don't even need to write it down because you can remember these 3 words. Here's what I want you to do this week with somebody at home. Make a memory. Make a memory. There is never a bad time to make a good memory. There's never a bad age to make a good memory. Do something old, do something new, just do something that brings joy to your home. Maybe that's dinner, maybe that's playing a game together, maybe that's going to a movie, taking a walk. Maybe you just pull out old photos and start remembering some of the great things that you have done. But here's the thing, don't wait for it to happen. Make it happen. Memories have to be made. Because here's the deal, if you neglect the home, like if you keep giving your first fruits to all the people outside your home and your coworkers and your classmates and all these other people in your life, and then you come home and you give leftovers to the people at home, if you do that, there's a day coming when the guitar amp is going to blare, the famine's going to come, the argument's going to come, the voices are going to raise, the heart is going to race, the anger is going to rise, and if you don't have these good memories to draw from, if you don't have these wonderful parts of your life that you've already put in place, then what's going to happen is it's going to be so much harder to manage that conflict. See, the culture of your home, it's going to determine the quality of your life, and you've got to make that happen. So make a memory. Some of you might need to make a memory today. I want you to think one more time about this theme verse from Genesis. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. Such a good statement about what God does. Some of you are lugging something around that's pretty negative, and it's making you pretty sad or pretty angry or pretty embarrassed, and you don't know what to do about it. This is where God's the expert. And so what I would encourage you to do, if you need to this morning, is I want you to let God work on the worry. And in order to let God work on the worry, like whatever you're lugging around, you got to share that with somebody else. And so maybe you do that in Bible class today, and there's something you haven't told someone, you got to share it today in prayer request time. Maybe a Q group tonight, there's just this burden and you don't know what to do with it. Share that with somebody else. God can take something bad and turn it into something good. He often does it through his people. And we have to learn to share that. And so if you need to share that today, we're about to sing the song, and this is the time where we share things with each other. We pray for each other. Do you know that the moment when God, in the greatest way, turns something bad into something good? It was the cross. Like the story of Joseph might be where God started taking something bad and making it good, but God perfected that at the cross. He took something so dark and tragic, and he turned it into the salvation of the world. And we meet that salvation in baptism, and if you need to do that, we want to give you that opportunity this morning. Let's stand and let's worship.